and what God can become. And he's definitely right in saying that Mormonism does more to bring God and man close to one another. Now, I think that is a mouthful, because the chasm that separates the two in the early fathers is insurmountable.
Well, that's your construction of the fathers.
I would invite anyone to read the fathers for themselves and determine whether that's the case.
I would too. I haven't heard you though address yourself to any of the quotations of the fathers. I'd like to hear you tell us what this deification means. I mean, it has disappeared out of Western Christianity.
I just discussed it. You asked me what does that mean, and I spoke to you of the fact that what they are talking about, it's very similar to
salvation. But why has that disappeared?
Why are they not using the word salvation? Why are they talking about?
They do.
I know, but why is there a separate word? Why is there a separate concept of deification and becoming gods and using that specific word? If this is just sort of the same thing as salvation.
Even the sources that Peterson and Rick cite say salvation defined as deification.
That's right.
So Pelican makes it very clear that when the fathers speak of deification, they're speaking of that solely in the sense of what salvation is. And salvation brings about the full redemption of mankind, the full unity of the redeemed with Jesus Christ. And you're not totally correct to say, maybe the specific terminology is not used in Western Christianity, but if you are familiar at all, for example, with Jonathan Edwards, you would know that there is a strong emphasis in his eschatology upon the fact that the redeemed are partakers of the divine nature, and that they are united with Christ in an ever-increasing fashion throughout eternity. And so it is present, and yet he as well is the first one to stand up and say, God has eternally been God. I am a creature. I am different than God. I will always be God's creature. I will never, ever, ever be God by nature. As the early fathers said.
How often have you, in your lifetime, commented to somebody that you believe that you will become a god?
I don't.
Okay, the early church fathers are doing it over and over. I'll bet I have 300 quotations that I've collected over the last 6-8 years.
And I bet you they said that there was one true God far more times than they said you could become a god, right?
Well, it doesn't matter. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that
you
point.
Have to.
You're saying, okay, you're focusing on that. I'm saying, why is it, if somebody says, I'm going to become a god, is that all right? Is it okay to say that?
Is it okay to say that?
And why don't you say? Why isn't that being said today? And I've never heard anybody say that.
What is the rule of faith for the early fathers? You ask me if it's okay if someone says they're a god. My first question for them would be, what do you believe? What is the rule of faith for the early fathers? I mean, they talk about that far more than they talk about deification. I can guarantee you that by 20-fold. What is the rule of faith for the fathers? The rule of faith for the fathers is there is one eternal God, the creator of all things.
You're not going to answer Graham's question.
I am getting to it right now. Now, if someone believes that there is one eternal God, he has eternally been God, and that I am his creature, created by him, and he wants to talk about the becoming a God through union with Jesus Christ, that's one thing. And that's what the early fathers did. And that was the context in which they spoke. They made it clear at the very beginning, when they catechized the new convert, there is one God who has eternally been God. Now, when I hear Joseph Smith saying it is the most basic it is a basic principle of the gospel to know that God was once a man like you and I are a man, I go, wait a minute, at the very start, the very get-go, the two have now gone two completely different directions.
Well, in your point of view,
James, you've made that point at least 15 times tonight. I don't know how many times you need to make it. You can make it until it sticks. If that's all we're going to discuss, you know, we can end at 9 o'clock because there's, I mean, you know, how many times do you need to beat a dead horse?
How often did the FBI persecute John Gotti? You know, what can I say? You got to repeat it until it sticks. You know,
let me read to you a statement by Hubert Cunliffe Jones in his highly acclaimed book, History of Christian Doctrine, published by Fortress Press, 1981. And he says this. He says, we have touched on various aspects of patristic thought about man's salvation. There are two central ideas repeatedly expressed by the writers of this period. The first of these is the concept of deification as the goal of salvation. That's the goal of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Salvation is one thing. The goal of salvation is deification. The most direct and indeed startling expression of the idea of deification in the New Testament is the characterization of believers as partakers of the divine nature, 2 Peter 1 verse 4. But the usual scriptural basis for this idea is the Pauline teaching on adoptive sonship towards God and the recreation of believers in the likeness of the Son of God. And he goes on in several chapters to quote and talk about all of the early church, not all the early church fathers, but for about 40 pages, talking about the early church fathers, their ideas on this, bringing out some of the differences. One of the things that you were saying earlier is that this sort of thing, the deification potential, as you see it, is something that comes about by grace. That's an idea which is only presented by a few of the early fathers. Most of the early church fathers are not presenting that idea. It's something that a person acquires through, in fact, there are all kinds of lists through these quotations, but it's something that it isn't something that's just acquired by grace. Now, let me just put back to you the question, how do you feel about the early church fathers who believe that deification is something that comes about through obedience and living a certain kind of a life? I mean, is that an acceptable idea as to deification, and also the idea that it's a goal of salvation? It's not identified. It's not identical with salvation.
Pelican says it's the goal of salvation as well. I understand that, and again, as I pointed out, even with Jonathan Edwards, that's something that is future in being in the perfect union with Jesus Christ after leaving this mortal existence. I already pointed that out. Ask how I respond to that, and here comes time number 16. Within their context, I have no problem with that. Their context, however, is not in any way analogous to the discussion of Mormonism. Now, you just said, maybe you were just asking a question, the difference between those who said something about it being by grace, which is the Eastern perspective, and supposedly those teaching it by works. Are you trying to bring in the grace and works issue? Because the grace that Pelican is talking about is the difference between nature and grace, not between grace and works. Are you aware of that?
Well, the point that Cunliffe Jones brings out in this, and all he's doing is bringing in statements from 100 or so different statements from early church fathers on this, is that their view of how a person came to be deified, there was a difference in point of view on that.
Well, possibly I can very, very quickly move us on to the next point in saying this. The point from Pelican and others in emphasizing the grace aspect is that even if a person were into, quote-unquote, a works system, they would say that even the ability to do the works was dependent upon grace, and that the actual deification would be an act of God's power, and it was not inherent in man. I read that a little bit earlier. I read it a little bit quickly. But it was not something that was inherently the ability of man. And even from the perspective, as I understand from the LDS perspective, it would not be within man's power to deify himself. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. So, Ms. Branch, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to make just a real quick comment and then get the both of your points of view. As I understand it, and this is my concept, is that we have a council in heaven in which Jesus and Satan, who were brothers, offered up a plan to the Father. Actually, Satan offered a plan. Jesus accepted the plan of the Father. They were brothers. They were our brothers. Now, this is as spiritual children, not as physical children on the earth. Now, when, of course, our Heavenly Father accepted His own plan, which was the right to come to earth and choose good or evil, thereby weeding out those children that would not follow the Father. As a reward for the doing what the Father has asked, we are given the right to become gods under Him, with our own worlds, with our own families, in the same way that we were His children. Now, I'll let you go ahead and discuss that from there.
Was that addressed to anyone?
I think it was addressed to both guests here.
Was the question, is that an accurate presentation of the LDS perspective? I'd say that
it's an accurate presentation of what the Bible teaches me.
Well, I obviously would disagree because the Bible nowhere teaches that Jesus is the spirit brother of Lucifer.